presentar al doctor Laurence Kirmayer. Es profesor y director de la División de Psiquiatría Social y Transcultural del Departamento de Psiquiatría de la Universidad de McGill. El profesor Kirmayer expondrá sobre el conocimiento co-constructivo en salud mental global, percepciones desde el trabajo con comunidades indígenas en Canadá.
Thank you very much. I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking all the organizers for the opportunity to be here with you and take part in this conversation about global mental health. I also have to apologize because my level of Spanish is below preschool, nursery school level. So I can understand about 20–30% because of the similarities to French, which I speak reasonably well. But otherwise I am like a child. So thank you for the privilege, really, of being able to speak in English. This is not incidental, of course, to the whole dynamic of global mental health. It's a legacy of colonialism on a global scale that I'm able to speak English here and in many other places, and that indeed the international language of science tends to be framed in English and has many consequences for the circulation of knowledge and our awareness of global variation. What I'm going to do in this conversation with you today is try to link some of the broad issues that were raised by Duncan Peterson in the first talk on the global inequities in health and the economic and political drivers of those inequities and the barriers to resolving them in some ways, and the more internal dilemmas within the production of psychiatric knowledge that Alan Young explored with the very rich example of the construction of post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. And my comments are going to, in a way, bridge these two because one powerful feature of global mental health is the attempt to institutionalize and export psychiatric knowledge in a form that implies that it's universally applicable, and so that we have already the tools that we need to understand and to resolve the problems globally. And it's to some degree that assumption that I'm going to challenge somewhat and explore what the implications are for doing global mental health in a different way that would involve serious dialogue and engagement with local communities, with local knowledges, and some kind of productive exchange, which has many implications, epistemological implications for the nature and production of knowledge, political implications for how power is distributed, and very practical implications in terms of how we function, whether as clinicians or researchers or policymakers and so on. So what I'm going to do is outline very briefly what some of the assumptions are in current efforts in global mental health, particularly the movement for global mental health as it's been framed as a sort of global regrouping of people who are committed to addressing global health inequalities. And then talk specifically about the aspects of this that are related to what we could call cultural and structural competence, that is, becoming aware of local context and how powerfully that shapes people's experience of mental suffering and the kinds of solutions that work for them, either individually or in families or communities. And this raises some very interesting questions, some very deep questions really, about the nature of knowledge, the nature of how communities are constituted around certain understandings of knowledge and practice. Again, this was something implicit in Alan's discussion about how psychiatry constitutes itself as an international community with certain agreed upon anchor points, and in the process maybe hides or puts to one side the very particular histories and very local contexts in which knowledge is generated. And then I'm going to use the example of work with Indigenous people in Canada to try to give some ideas about other ways of working that are more dialogical. This is interesting not only because it's my home country and it's our own internal dilemmas of dealing with huge inequalities in Canada, but because it also puts global mental health in a different perspective, that it's not just a question of some wealthy countries of the North, let's say, being concerned about other parts of the world and equity there, but it's an issue for every country in terms of internal inequalities and structural problems that sometimes are very similar to those experienced elsewhere. And it's for you to think about what elements of the Canadian sort of colonial and I don't know if we can say post-colonial situation are similar to that in Chile or in other Latin American countries, since all North, Central, and South America experienced European colonization in ways that were very profound for indigenous peoples. And then I'll try to bring out some general implications for global mental health. So as Duncan has already pointed out, our current efforts to address the inequalities on a global scale exist against a historical backdrop of very powerful forces of colonization and migration that have shaped the current configuration of nation states and international institutions in the contemporary world. And thinking through in an ongoing way the nature of post-colonial institutions is a very important part of this process. Psychologization, and more specifically psychiatrization, that is the implantation of particular ways of thinking about human beings and human problems and particular sets of practices related to some aspects of health, are part of those processes of global change. And they are interesting, I think, not only because it's part of our own everyday concerns as practitioners, but because they reach from the largest formations of global discourse down to very intimate spheres of life and how people understand the goals of their life and the sources of their problems and the ways to solve them. So trying to understand how the exportation and circulation of ideas in psychiatry reshapes individual experience of people in families and communities is a very important endeavor. It's one that's hard for those of us from within mental health to do very well because we're operating all the time with a shared set of assumptions, and we sometimes don't realize how striking and how different some of those assumptions may be from the way that people are living their lives every day. And we need to keep open a space to learn about that and have that dialogue. At the same time, psychiatry is not only offering things to people that they can make use of and they may take up because they seem to be à la mode or enabling or liberatory for people, but psychiatry also serves functions of social control, since among the spectrum of problems that we're mandated to deal with are included forms of suffering that can be very disruptive for families and for communities. And so a certain amount of social power is given to psychiatry, and this, of course, raises a whole set of profound ethical and human rights issues, and issues that have often been the focus of a great deal of critique of psychiatry in many places. Finally, the process of addressing global mental health on multiple scales reflects larger economic institutions and values, and in particular, as we'll come to, there are powerful ways in which the global pharmaceutical industry is a driver and a beneficiary of efforts in global mental health, and that in itself raises a very serious set of ethical issues that we need to be thinking about all the time. Duncan and I have tried to articulate, coming out of a symposium we had at McGill a few years ago with Vikram Patel and other leaders in global mental health, tried to articulate a critique of some aspects of global mental health from a more cultural, social structural, and political economic perspective. And it's based on analyzing kind of the logical structure or the core arguments of the movement for global mental health, which I think can be roughly summarized in this form. The first effort is to try to document the level of global burden and disparities in mental health, and the construction of the disability-adjusted life years and the various mathematical models that have been used to put non-communicable diseases and psychiatric disorders in particular on a kind of comparable metric to diseases that cause mortality has been a very important technical step in launching this argument. That leads to the second point, which is given the enormous burden that then can be projected largely through estimates around the world, it seems like mental health should be a much higher priority than it is. This is good news for mental health practitioners. Suddenly our work is much more important and deserves more money and more resources. I said there was no conflict of interest at the beginning. Clearly there's a very serious conflict of interest here in the sense that we all stand to gain in terms of having more impact and more resources to address our work. The third and fourth points are particularly important in terms of the more nuanced approach that we want to advocate for, and that is that the disparities globally are then framed in terms of a treatment gap. That is, given the fact that there's huge numbers of people who have different kinds of problems and are disabled by them, the presumed problem is that these people need more services. They need interventions, presumably provided by professionals or in a modality that is similar to what mental health practitioners would provide. And then, therefore, the main strategy is how can we take what we already know works in certain places and make it available, scale it up. So this is the bare outline of the logic of current efforts in global mental health. And the dilemmas are that each of these points can be contested to varying degrees, not simply to tear it down or to negate it, but to imply the need for more refined models for research and for ultimately a wider range, perhaps, of solutions and interventions. The first issue I've already alluded to, which is that these estimates of global burden are in fact very crude and assume that we have universally applicable methods of eliciting and diagnosing problems, and that is sufficient to canvass the range. That is, we're not leaving anything important out, and we're getting an accurate sense of the kinds of problems. And that, as I say, is very debatable in certain areas. The second is whether mental health problems per se are the best way of characterizing the inequalities that we're talking about, or whether they are merely an outcome, one of many outcomes of other structural inequalities, poverty, violence, and so on, that are drivers not only of mental health problems, but of all kinds of other problems, health and social inequalities, and so on. And the third, that we should frame this as a treatment gap rather than perhaps as a gap in local infrastructure at the level of community solidarity and indigenous healing resources, and that then has implications for the final step in the argument as to whether the goal is more psychiatry for everybody, or more psychology, or more community mental health workers, or whether there are also local indigenous processes of healing, of resilience, of economic development, and so on and so forth, that might be equally or at times more important strategies to ultimately improve mental health. I don't think, although this is perhaps a little bit challenging to mental health practitioners, I don't think in the bigger scheme of things any of these criticisms are particularly provocative or outrageous. They really fit with larger development agendas, and the remaining question is, what role does mental health play in all of this? So there are persistent controversies, and we had at this symposium a few years ago at McGill, as I say, we had people representing the global mental health movement, which is very much driven from a public health perspective that assumes that we can take the best evidence-based practices developed in urban centers in the North and the West and so on, and export those with minor modifications elsewhere. And they were, that sort of perspective was challenged by people coming from a much more grassroots community orientation, arguing that there really are different approaches and a different distribution of power that needs to happen for a healthier debate and a healthier process of developing strategies. But to some degree, the argument that occurred at our symposium was also around different kinds of problems. So the most heated disagreements seemed to occur when one person had in mind somebody with very severe mental illness, with chronic schizophrenia, let's say, who really was not functioning at all, and who was being physically restrained, was chained to a log somewhere in Indonesia, and really what the intervention that was needed was very basic. People just needed to get some medication and have their chains removed. It's kind of like Pinel all over again on a global scale. And that was contrasted then with people who had in mind somebody who was demoralized, who had mild to moderate depression for reasons that could be explained very much in terms of the adversity, social adversity that they were grappling with, and for which the solution might be some kind of activation and engagement in addressing those social problems. So those are both very valid issues, and maybe they require, at least in the short term, different approaches and different solutions. So the apparent argument may really come, in certain cases, may come down to having in mind a different problem and that we need differentiated solutions to address these different problems. But the last point, I think, is also important and will become central to the rest of my talk, that there is in political science a discussion around how to advance and address the inequalities in society, and this is often framed in terms of problems of redistribution. That is to say, money that is going to the wealthy few should be redistributed in some way so that everybody gets their fair share. But there's also recognition that the problems that people suffer from are not only related to economic differences, they're also related to certain kind of public civil recognition of who they are as people and as communities. And that requires a different solution. It's not just a solution about money, it's a solution that's framed in terms of processes of recognition. Recognition of political voice, recognition of way of life, recognition of values that may be in conflict with the dominant values of the dominant society. So that's what I want to come back to as we go along here. So the dilemma at a practical level of some of these persistent controversies in global mental health is that in trying to address these inequalities, a process that is often presented with a sense of real urgency, that is, people are really suffering now, something needs to be done now, and we can have all the discussions and debates we want, but in the meantime, we need to take action. In the process of doing that, there may be inadvertently a kind of suppression and undermining of local forms of solidarity. And that this may go on, part of the energy and many of the resources for global mental health from the beginning have been driven by economic interests that are in some ways at odds with, or in fairly direct conflict with, the needs and aspirations of local communities. And I've mentioned already the global pharmaceutical industry is one example of that. The perspectives of a small group of very powerful philanthropists who've been really pushing global health is another potential conflict. As well-intentioned as these individuals may be, they have their own particular views of the world, their own set of priorities, and these are playing a surprisingly large role in the way in which global agendas are being set. And the emphasis on professionals and professional mental health and psi disciplines becomes another potentially distorting effect on local forms of solidarity, helping and healing, to the extent that the models that come from psychology and psychiatry and other disciplines have, to varying degrees, unknowing ways, incorporated a particular set of values and perspectives that may be in some tension with local knowledge. So there's a whole set of tensions that are worth thinking about if we're serious about wanting to address the inequalities. We have to grapple with these, each of which is a major undertaking and requires particular kinds of expertise beyond just sort of expressing concern to really advance a more trenchant analysis and draw out the implications. We need to be working with colleagues coming from political science, coming from economics, coming from philosophy and other disciplines that can really help us to engage these questions. I think they're interesting questions to all of us, and those of us who work in mental health settings can enter into very interesting constructive partnerships with people from other disciplines, where we provide the examples, the problems to be thought about, and many different disciplines can then work together analyzing these sort of case studies or situations and enriching each other's understanding. So it's a prime set of problems for real interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary work. Since the overall orientation of these meetings is around ethical issues, I want to try to emphasize some of those as we go along, and to talk about it from the point of view, first of all, of how we create kinds of spaces and opportunities for genuine exchange between different points of view. And this is the leading toward the example that I will use of Indigenous health. Because the dilemma we have in general is that those who have the power and the authority to frame a problem in many ways dictate the way the whole discussion will go. And this is where Alan's discussion is so important. If we decide, look, the way to measure suffering in conflict areas is to go out and interview people about PTSD, then it's very clear what we're looking for, and we may not realize the extent to which we have prejudged both the problem and its ultimate solution. Because of having used one kind of frame or tool for analyzing the situation. So we need to be looking carefully at ways of thinking about global mental health problems in a more context-sensitive way. Jonathan Metzl, a historian and psychiatrist, and Helena Hansen, a psychiatrist, anthropologist, have written about the notion of structural competence, and they made this intervention in the US context where cultural competence has become a kind of catchword for a whole set of approaches trying to look at diversity and inequality within American society. But they suggested that cultural competence and the emphases implicit in cultural competence were not sufficient, and in fact risked diverting attention from structural violence in American society. The fact of a sort of racialized underclass that has persisted for, since the time of slavery, the ongoing sort of social class differences that really powerfully determine people's opportunities and their exposures to things like violence and to their resources for recovery, and that clinicians, both at a clinical level in terms of how one interprets a problem and researchers in terms of how they frame health questions, needed to employ a kind of structural competence where they thought about the adversities people were facing from a more structural and social view. This is not, does not exclude cultural competence, but it's meant to be an essential complement and enlargement of the focus in a way, and it keeps on the table a constant reflection on what the most powerful determinants are, what should be taken into consideration in health policy, and even at the level of a clinician analyzing a patient's predicament. So it's important that we conceive of this not as an either-or, and in particular, I think you can make the argument that considerations of culture and context shape all of these structural issues. Sometimes when people talk about social structural problems, the notion is, well, now we're really getting to the core, to poverty, inequality, violence. These are such brute facts of human existence. They trump or transcend, I don't like using the word trump anymore, the word has been spoiled for me. They transcend any particular cultural contextual analysis, but in fact, structural arrangements in each society are shaped by cultural histories and underwritten by culturally constructed categories. So the identities we have as immigrants or refugees or settlers or indigenous peoples, as members of a certain social class, of a racialized group, as members of an ethnic group, all of these are culturally constructed. They come out of a local history of who different groups are, and they then have structural consequences. That is, by virtue of your skin color in North America, you will have certain kinds of encounters with the police on a more frequent basis than other people. You will experience certain kinds of microaggression and hostile reactions to people in a very small scale way, in a way that really impacts on your life. You will internalize certain notions of yourself that will be a constant kind of drain on your cognitive resources. So in a sense, then a culturally constructed category that says these people are lesser in some way reproduces itself in many social structural ways. So this is, first of all, to break down the distinction, I guess, between cultural ideologies and contexts and structural phenomena, and then to insist that we need to understand these in very particular ways in different societies. So the versions of understanding racialized identity that work in the US do not fit that well in Canada, although we're pretty saturated with US television and so on, so it definitely has an impact, but the demographic constitution of the society, the histories of migration are different, and the current politics of identity are different. And of course, you can go across Latin America, and each country will have its own particular history, its own ways of dealing with the fact of colonization, of the intermixing of settlers with indigenous peoples, and how much that is acknowledged or hidden in local ideologies of identity and so on. So all these are very important in terms of structural factors, some of which are explicit, everyone's aware of, some of which are hidden and just part of the fabric of everyday life that you only become aware of if you are in a disadvantaged position yourself, or if you go out and try to analyze these. So this is an argument, I think, for why we have to be looking at context, and a very important argument for consideration in terms of the global exportation of health models, because simply talking about inequality in some crude way about just economic differences is not sufficient to get at the kinds of structural disadvantage, the kinds of violence that people may be experiencing in everyday life that have serious mental health consequences. There's an even more, I can say, subtle aspect to these cultural differences that I want to then touch on briefly, and because it'll become important in the example I'm going to give you, which centers around the role that specific kinds of knowledge and tradition play in people's own sense of identity and community. So you can make the argument that there are, and we all in fact participate in to different degrees, communities that could be described in part as epistemic communities. That is to say, what constitutes the community as a group is a certain shared notion of how knowledge is produced and how authoritative knowledge can be sought and obtained and protected and applied. I say we all participate in these because to become a clinician, to become a physician, a psychologist, a social worker, a nurse, any mental health professional, is to take part in a certain epistemic community. Often this is a community grounded in some version of science, although in professional schools people don't learn that much science per se. They kind of receive science as a kind of catechism in a way, that they get the products of science, not necessarily the methodology of science. And that's in some ways inevitable, because to be a scientist is to have a certain platform and then to have a lot of skepticism and doubt so you can generate new questions and do new work. To be a practitioner is to have a platform and have a certain level of confidence so that you can intervene in a way that may be kind of risky and demanding, and you have to have some trust that what you're doing makes sense. So exactly around the issues that a scientist wants to question and be doubtful about and can afford a kind of radical skepticism at times, a clinician is in a predicament if they go too far in that direction. So there's some differences already in those two communities, and it's interesting to understand how the nature of knowledge changes as it moves from the domain of an active research area into the domain of clinical work, and what gets hidden in that process. And certainly all the marketing that goes on to sell people pharmaceuticals using very simplified models of the brain that no neuroscientist would really accept on a good day, but that make for nice posters and simple arguments and so on, is one very concrete example that we're all exposed to all the time. In some cases, there are notions of knowledge that are deeply rooted in local historical traditions and that are part of how people define themselves, that come into direct conflict then with the push going on, and global mental health is part of this, to ground clinical work and public health interventions in evidence and in evidence-based practice, and evidence being defined in terms of a certain dominant epistemic paradigms of science. So if we acknowledge that there might be different kinds of knowledge in circulation with different degrees of justification, different modes of justification, and different domains of application, If we want to, we can either dismiss all that and say, look, in the end, it's all going to be validated by science. And one response to people coming forward and saying, well, we believe that this other thing works, is to say, fine, go do a randomized clinical trial and come back to me when that's done. And if it works, then we'll take seriously what you're saying. And if it doesn't work, then we can rule it out to court. But another approach is to say, well, maybe what you're looking at, what you're looking for, is a little bit different than what we're looking for. And maybe what you get out of doing a particular form of healing, let's say, is not only a cure of symptoms, but also a strengthened sense of identity, a strengthened sense of community, a sense of meaning for the future. Okay. Okay. In which case, we would need different ways of comparing things. And this raises a set of questions around pluralism and how we are going to put these together in different societies. So that leads to my last, my example, really, where I want to talk about this just very briefly in the last minute or so. To acknowledge in the Canadian context, we have had a country that's built on a process of colonization of Indigenous people, most of whom died because of infectious diseases and so on, as they did throughout the Americas. But then in the 1800s, Canada instituted a policy of forced assimilation using residential schools. And this led to 150,000 children over the years being put in these schools and not allowed to speak their language, not allowed to learn their traditions, and being forced to adopt Euro-Canadian ways. We've had just recently in Canada an apology from the government and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that just published in December its final report. And in the process then, we have had a reconfiguration of the research landscape and of the ways in which health issues are being approached. And this has been framed in terms of cultural safety, in terms of acknowledging this history and creating environments where there can be true dialogue between different points of view, and ultimately modes of working that are shaped not only by the exigencies of science, but also by the collective values of Indigenous peoples, creating a very complex landscape where issues of ownership, intellectual property rights, for example, and control over data by Indigenous people have become paramount. And this has shaped all the research. So the project that I won't have time to describe today, but you can find out about on this website, is a project that's going on in many First Nations communities across Canada right now for them to develop their own programs of mental health promotion for Indigenous youth centered on culture, in which they take a general template for a program and then can adapt it locally so that they are reconstituting their own sense of collective identity. So it's an interesting way to take some evidence-based practices that we think are generally helpful to people, but to open them up to very thorough kind of reconsideration of cultural dimensions of identity and experience. This is a training group of facilitators that went on a few months ago, and a picture of a graduating family from this program a few years ago in central British Columbia. And what this project raises really is a whole set of questions about the role that serious attention to culture and context can play in reconfiguring mental health in ways that are not in conflict with local values, but really working in some kind of collaborative, creative way, and that is mutually enriching, because I think we all feel, those of us who are participating in this, that we've gained a tremendous amount in our own understanding of the nature of mental health, of wellness, and of sources of recovery and well-being. So this points toward ways of approaching global mental health in the future that would be more dialogical, more about exchange and co-construction of knowledge, and encourages us to think about what are the prerequisites for that to happen in terms of redistribution of power, in terms of resources, in terms of conceptual models that allow a legitimate place for very different perspectives coming from different cultural points of view. And this requires both an internal critique in psychiatry, which this paper tries to do something of, and elaborating a kind of eco-social model, which this book tries to do something of, and which we will be continuing at our Advanced Study Institute, which I hope some of you can attend, and I brought some copies here to give you more information about that in our summer school. And I thank you very much for your attention.